What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Jimmy James, 59, and I'm starting something of a series that I'm doing here, right? This is my Ungarrisoned, right, series where it's just kind of an opportunity for me to just think about a topic or just think about the game in general in, I think, a little bit of a semi-structured way. Sometimes I'm just going to riff on this, but I may even invite people to come on this. Let me know if you'd like actually to see something like that. But with that being said, right, let me know if you enjoy this kind of content. A lot of my speculation and, I don't want to call them just chatting videos, but just videos where we think a bit more in a a loose and less directed sense about the game. I've done pretty well in the past, and if you like content like that where it's really just chill vibes and chill conversation, right, I definitely want you to let me know in the comment section below, because I'll be sure to do more videos like that. With that being said, in this episode of Ungarrisoned, you're going to get my ungarrisoned thoughts on how I'd adjust the Dynasties of India civilizations. And so I really want to start off with the Bengalis. I want to look at Bengalis and Dravidians because to me they both have the same problem. And so I'm going to put them together here. And I think though that problem needs to be addressed a little bit differently. Now, when we think about the Bengalis, right? It's worth noting that the Bengalis do have a role in the game right now, situationally, right? This is a civilization that is something of a late game powerhouse, right? The eco bonus allows you to get ahead in villagers, and you do have some strong units late, like the Ratha and Elephants that resist a lot of bonus damage to their typical counters, and also resist conversion from monks. So the Bengalis have some options, and I think of the two what we would consider bad civs in Bengalis and Dravidians. As we try to figure out the roles of those civilizations, this is the one, right? This is a late game civ, and I think the trick for modifying a late game civilization is to give them the tools to get to the late game, but not having those tools be something that impact that late game, because I actually think they already have that covered, right? So you could take, for instance, a civilization like the Goths. The Goths are clearly a late game civ, but it's not like they can't do anything early, right? Even in the early game, actually, Goth players can make games messy for opponents, and they have options in their tech tree, such as fully upgraded knights in the Castle Age, that are really meant to help them get to that next level and just survive. And once you get to the Imperial Age, the heavy cavalry really fall off for Goths. Now, it's worth noting that the recent patch tried to address the Bengalis mid-game, and I think they did so in a really interesting way. They gave their monks, +3 melee and pierce armor, basically the old Slav, I think it was the orthodoxy technology that the Slavs lost in a recent patch. The Bengalis got that as a civ bonus. I really liked this change. I thought this was a really good change because monks in the mid game, at least like that first part of the mid game when there's not a ton of units on the field, monks are actually a really strong counter unit to knights and camels, which I think Bengalis really struggle with, because one of the problems is that you don't generate a lot of damage in terms of, just being able to put the numbers, right, of damage out there on the field until late Castle Age, because your elephant archers lack thumb ring, and that means that not only do they fire slower, but elephant archers are very inaccurate. I think they only hit 70% of their shots against a stationary target, so a lot of your shots are hitting the ground, actually. And you can't really change the firing rate until you research the pikes technology, which means that accuracy will still be a problem, but you got to purchase that tech, you got to get a castle up. That's very difficult. Same goes for the Ratha, right? It also needs pikes to really get its firing rate up there. You need to create it from a castle. It needs about 1 million upgrades to really be able to use the unit as it's intended, transitioning between melee and range. So It's not really a strong Castle Age option for the civilization. And your crossbows in the mid-game lack thumb ring, so that means they also fall behind in terms of damage output, though it's worth noting you do get Arbalest with Bracer late. But again, the civilization's late game, I really don't think a problem, right? The Civ's play style in the mid-game just leaves them with a lot of limitations to do damage, and it feels like this is not a Civ that you can easily raid your opponents with, and that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, because you're meant, right, to try to survive and get to the late game. And we really need to think of that civilization's identity, of this being a late game Civ. So what's a tool that we can give them to survive in the mid game, but that wouldn't be overpowered? And how can we make sure that this is a strong late game civilization? Because if you're not going to be able to do a ton of damage early, then we need to make sure that they are strong late. And so the task for opponents, in the same way that the task against Goths, right, is to try to kill them early, the task against Bengalis would also be to try to kill them early. I think there's really two things you could do, and so we can address the mid game first. I think, despite that, I don't think a lot of people want to hear this, but I think we need to give them knights or camels in the mid game, but not give them that Imperial Age upgrade. So if they got knights, they don't get Cavalier, or if you gave them camel, you don't get access to the heavy camel rider. Now, a lot of people don't like to hear that because, for some reason with some of the newer civilizations, people seem to act that this is an extreme affront to history, yet we're all pretty okay with a lot of other historical accuracies in the game, or even if we're not okay with them, we at least tolerate them, and and it doesn't generate the same kind of vitriol to suggest that they get knights or camels. But I actually think that the historical criticism is even a bit misguided. I will say that just through a brief sort of cursory search, right, my understanding is that at least in the Bengali Sultanate, one of the reasons that cavalry was a weak point for the Bengali Sultanate was that horses actually needed to be imported from abroad. And I think that that's a perfect argument for allowing them to just have access to knights or the sort of standard camel rider, right? I think it reflects the fact that this is a civilization that didn't have their own indigenous core of, heavy cavalry that would require, a lot of training and investment, etc. over time, right? And so and so because of that, right, you could only have a sort of, what we might call, the sort of base version of it, right? And I think that would reflect that fact historically fairly well. I mean, it's not like horses didn't exist, for this civilization before, because they get fully upgraded like cavalry. So if we have a problem with them having, horses in general, I think you have to think about get rid of the light cavalry as well. And of course, obviously that would present strategic difficulties in the game, but that's the point, right? And that's the point that I'm getting at, right? We accept that with the light cavalry, but we don't tend to accept that with knights or camels. And so I think the way you do that is just by making their knights and camels extremely limited, and you make them extremely limited by limiting their utility to the mid game, which is where the Bengalis really are at their weakest. And that's why I think it'd be actually a nice solution for the civilization. The other change that I think that the Bengalis need is, I think they need the last infantry armor upgrade. You're a late game civilization, you need to survive, and you have some really expensive units in the late game. And you want to be able to support those units. And I just think that lacking the last infantry armor upgrade makes it really difficult for them to make reasonable halberdiers and champions to support their very expensive units. I will say, as an aside, I think that Rotha plus light cavalry is a really, really nice combo, and I don't feel like we see it enough. But if you're going elephants, you really can't make light cavalry because the food is too expensive. And so the idea here is that if you give them the last infantry armor upgrade, you're going to be able to make support units that do a much better job of supporting those really expensive late game units that basically with Bengalis, you're playing, 40 minutes to get to that comp. And so if you're going to be forced to play into that style, I think we need to make sure that that's pretty strong. And right now, it just doesn't feel as strong as it needs to be, because even though your elephants are resisting some bonus damage, halberdiers are doing so much damage late game that they're still really strong. And even skirmishers, right, from other civilizations that, are getting more damage, later, and with bracer perhaps, a little more range. I just think if those units need a little bit more protection. So that would, I think, truly make this civilization the late game powerhouse that obviously its role is designed for, but it just kind of hasn't hit its sweet spot yet. Now, if we take a look at the Dravidians, I think that this civilization is much closer to being complete than the Bengalis. You have a nice early game that can allow you to get ahead, and now with the addition of bombard cannons in the late game, your late game doesn't feel bad. It just feels a bit slow and ponderous. It reminds people a lot of the Teutons, but you do have some better range. And so I think because of that, right, with those range units, I do think the civilization has a really nice identity. Now, unlike the Bengalis, this is a civilization where it really feels like you can get a lot of damage done out in the field. You have fully upgraded crossbow and arbalist in the mid-game, which is very nice, and getting the extra wood upon hitting each age helps you afford technologies like thumb ring or ballistics to actually get those units powered up more quickly. And in addition to that, your elephant archers shoot faster, right? And so they have insane DPS, especially once you get thumb ring. These guys are like machine guns, and they're actually a pretty strong unit in the mid game, I gotta say. And then in the late game, right, the steel technology makes your infantry very powerful, and it also gives your light cavalry a little bit of a roll. Though, maybe not the strongest one at the moment. Like the Bengalis, the problem for Dravidians is in their mid game. As Dravidians, you really only have two options. You have elephant archers and crossbows. And both of those units are hard countered by skirmishers. Now, to counter skirmishers, usually you make knights, mangonels, maybe add skirms of your own. Well, you can't make knights, so that option's out. And you can make mangonels of your own, but if you're up against skirmishers and knights, your opponent can basically, commit to an attack, kill the mangonel really quickly, and then just run away. And I don't think in that case even that many knights would die, unless you had all of your upgrades. And if you're trying to afford mangonels and do that, that is really tough. You would have to really make sure you had a good elephant mass to be able to do that, and you probably also had thumb ring for that DPS. So I think making mangonels of your own is really difficult. And if knights go in and just suicide themselves anyways, you still have skirmishers that are churning through your crossbows or elephant archers. And especially that's a problem with your elephant archers because they're just so expensive. So skirmishers are still going to wreck you, and the knights are going to be getting good value. Your opponent's knights are going to be getting good value in that situation. So I don't think that's really a great answer. Now, you do have good skirmishers to add of your own, and I think right now that's probably your best counter if you're up against, say, like Knight Skirmisher in the mid-game. But again, you have to think about that those are also going to die fairly hard to Knights who can thin out their ranks, while the enemy Skirmishers are thinning out your Elephant Archers pretty quickly. And I think that Dravidian Elephant Archers, once you get them in a big mass and have all your upgrades, is good against Knights. But I still would say even then, because of the mobility, I wouldn't say it's a hard counter, right? I think you can win fights and be more successful in fights than that. But skirmishers are going to be taking out those really expensive units of yours. And so I think even adding skirms isn't a problem. And I think that knights will be able to clean up enough of your own skirms to where you're going to have trouble, because even adding your own skirms against the skirms of other opponents, it's not like they're going to be taking out skirms, just in a flash, in a heartbeat, right? It's just sort of marginally better at that point because both units have such high pierce armor. And I also would say it's a pretty difficult thing to counter mangonels even with a civilization if you're on a crossbow. It's so common to see civilizations with awful cavalry like Vikings or Koreans make knights in the mid-game to deal with this. But Dravidians' only option is to make mangonels of their own, and again, that runs into the problem of being suicided by knights, who, are going to be more population efficient, and even if some Dravidian crossbows, which are just generic, right? Even if they take out a few knights, the knights are still going to be able to take out the mangonels. And I don't think that we should expect a civilization on a castle age economy, even with the even with the Dravidians, cheaper infantry barracks upgrades, right? So you can get pikemen a bit cheaper. Even with that, I don't think that we can expect this civilization to be able to afford to make crossbows or elephant archers, plus pikes, plus mangonels on a castle age economy. What all of this means is, I think, like the Bengalis, Dravidians need an option in the mid-game to respond to skirmishers and mangonels. Now, before I had said that I actually think that the Dravidians need knights, and I think I've backed off of that because I think that there are some more unique things we can do with them with their light cavalry, and I've actually been a little bit involved with the thread on Reddit about this, and where we've been kind of kicking some of these ideas around. And here's the idea, right? The idea is basically to try to give their light cavalry a buff, in particular a buff to their DPS early on, and the idea is that this would enable them to snipe mangonels and kill skirmishers more easily. Now, there's a few suggestions out there, and I think that one of the reasons that people, and I've seen others talk about Dravidian light cavalry an awful lot, because I think people would really like to see Woot Steel Light Cav as a reasonable late game option with this civilization. I know that this is, it's not a cavalry civ, right? But in the same way, that a lot of infantry civs have, say, like archer options, right? And a lot of infantry civilizations, in fact, even have reasonable light cavalry options, right? Where Japanese have, decent light cavalry. Goths, again, right, have hussars that are just missing the last armor upgrade. So I don't think that this is the craziest thing to suggest something like this. And so I think that what you want to do is you want to make this really unique. And so one of the really interesting ideas that somebody had presented in one of these threads is to, in keeping right with the fact that the barracks is a powerful building for this civ, to let the light cavalry benefit from the upgrades at the barracks that are available at that cheaper cost. And so what that would mean is they would benefit from something like supplies that could make them cheaper. It would benefit from husbandry, so you'd be able to get a little bit more of that speed back. And you'd also be able to benefit from arson, which would allow you to do a little bit more damage against buildings. I think this is a really, really interesting option, and it would definitely help them in the mid-game quite a bit. And you have to remember, right, that this is combined with the fact that the units lack bloodlines, right? So, if we think about each of these, right, Squires is basically a substitute for husbandry that you're just getting a little bit cheaper. And that would be nice, I think, for the civilization. Arson +2 attack against buildings for a unit that doesn't have a really high base attack, I think helps it probably a little bit. Though that's probably not the biggest thing. The most interesting one here is supplies, right? Now, the thing you gotta remember with supplies is that in the feudal age, supplies is not a cheap technology. We rarely see it researched in the feudal age, though it would be very interesting to give a civilization like this 65 HP scouts in the early game, but you gotta remember they would lack bloodlines. And the question for supplies is, when does it pay off? And I actually think unless you're committing to an all-in scout rush, which would be pretty dicey for a civ that lacks bloodlines, supplies probably doesn't pay for itself in feudal age, where you are still needing to commit a lot of food to the units, even if it's 65 food. And so it's actually pretty tricky, right? I think if you're trying to use supplies in the feudal age, I think it probably sets you back a lot more. But in the mid-game, in Castle Age, when you're getting a lot more units out in the field, say you research supplies during the transition, say, instead of something like bloodlines, all of a sudden it gets really, really interesting. And it's worth noting supplies is cheaper with the civilization, so it might not be as much of an investment, which I actually think makes this option really, really interesting, because we want to make it costly, but again, this is a unit that misses bloodlines, and it should be, and so it, should be something that that the Civ can actually get to. Now, that doesn't solve the DPS problem. I think that gets us close, but I think one of the issues, though, is that in Castle Age, this would still be a unit with 60 HP and 4 Pierce Armor in the mid-game. And those really strong gold units like Knights or Camels or Crossbows, I think are still going to be a bit too strong. And, we need this to fit the identity of the civilization, but also to be able to actually counter units, you need to put damage out in the field. So there's a few options for this and that we've kicked around, and I'll present their first two and I'll put them sort of in order of, I have 3 options here, and I'm going to put them in order of how interesting I think they are. One option is to let their light cavalry be affected by Thumb Ring. This would give them a bit more of an attack rate boost, and well, I think that the benefit of this idea is that it wouldn't affect the attack rate of their scouts in Feudal Age at all. It would be purely a Castle Age and Beyond option. And again, that's what we're really trying to address with this civilization. I do think it is a little bit odd, and especially if they're already benefiting from barracks technologies, just the idea of why Thumb Ring would benefit, it's like substantively why the Thumb Ring would benefit a light cavalry. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, because that's not really what Thumb Rings were used for. So the next idea that I thought was really interesting is someone suggested that the light cav maybe should just get the 25% higher attack rate that your elephant archers and skirmishers are getting. Now, assuming that you allowed this to start in Feudal Age, I think this could get really interesting. All of a sudden, this really puts scout rushing on the table, especially if they're affected by the other the barracks upgrades that are already cheaper for Dravidians. And I think that not having bloodlines feels like it balances out. Not having bloodlines, I think, is critical to the balance of all of this. And so I think that gets really, really interesting, and it opens up the strategy profile for the civilization. Now, I do think it's possible that could just be a little overpowered for a scout rush. And the fact that you're getting it for free as soon as you get up makes it a little bit too easy for me. I think that we should be careful how many free technologies or benefits we give a civilization. Already having the high DPS with the faster attack rate on skirmishers and elephant archers, they may already have what they need to get for free. So one way to do that is to try to give them that same idea, but force the civilization to have to invest into it. And so the other option, right, would be, I think, and I'll tell you why I like this option a little bit better, is that we allow Dravidian light cavalry, or maybe even just stable units in general, to benefit from infantry attack upgrades. And so this is really interesting because it would be a way to kind of honor this whole like Woot Steel identity of, we have these, this is a civilization that the whole idea is that they have weapons, right, that cut through armor and do more damage, right? So that's why it's this like high damage kind of civilization. This gets really interesting because you can have scouts that do 5+2 damage in the Feudal Age, 7+4 light cav in the Castle Age, 7+8 light cavalry in the Imperial Age. Now, you have to think about this in that for 2 reasons. One, you're missing bloodlines, so your units are going to be squishy, but you have to invest in this, right? So to get 5+2 scouts in Feudal, you have to actually go to the blacksmith and research technologies that cost their full amount. So you have to spend 250 food to do this in the Feudal Age. That's a major investment for a unit that doesn't have as much HP, but if you can get there, right, you could probably fight against at least other scouts that do have that HP. And so I think that makes things really, really interesting for this civilization. Same thing for the light cavalry in the Castle Age, right? Being able to get 7+4 would be really nice because you'd be able to do a lot of damage to skirmishers. Take out mangonels a bit easier because you basically have the damage output of knights with forging, but you're only on 60 HP, whereas, knights have 100, even 120 if you have bloodlines. So I guess, and it's still, even if this were a unit that benefited from barracks upgrades, like say supplies, it's a unit that's still costing you a lot of food. And that's the whole point here, right? You would actually have to research these upgrades. And so it would be a way of giving them the DPS of knights, right? But while being a unit that's not a knight replacement. Moreover, this is not a unit that you could just make in every situation, right? You're still going to lose to heavy cavalry and camels with this unit, and in the late game, the low armor and lack of bloodlines would allow this unit to be cleaned up by archers, right? So it's still a fairly situational unit, but the point is that it can help you address some of those situations in the mid game, right? If you really committed to this unit, right, you may be able to address some of those situations in the mid game that cause the Dravidians to, along with the Bengalis, to have one of the worst win rates in the game. So obviously both of these civilizations need changes, and the question I think is how to make them unique. Now, I think the idea for Dravidians here is probably the most unique because there's not a light cav in the game that has this, and we still wouldn't have them, have knights. So this is a really unique upgrade for the Dravidians, and in my mind, I think it fixes their biggest problem. Getting back to the Bengalis, I think Bengalis they're a problem that to me is a lot more difficult to solve, and so I'd be curious in the comments, what do you guys think of Bengalis? The Bengalis are so difficult to solve here. I think a lot of people have suggested, especially some of the more big name players in the community, guys like Hera and the pro level casters like Mim, have joked that the best buff for Bengalis is to remove them from the game and just completely start over. I think I've heard both of those guys joke about that. So, and if I've confused them, I apologize to both. But the point, though, right, is that a lot of people see Bengalis as almost unsalvageable as a civilization. So I'd be interested to know, do you guys think that there's anything that we can do to salvage Bengalis in the game? I think Dravidians would be much, much closer. And so they just need a bit of a bump, right? But Bengalis as the elephant civ, I don't see a way out of it for them without giving them knights or camels. And to me, as long as you didn't give them the Imperial Age upgrades, I still think that preserves their identity primarily as an elephant civilization. But that's just me. And that's the end of this video, right? So again, right, this is kind of a rambling kind of stream of conscious video. I hope you enjoyed the music. Check out my new album that's out. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Some of the music from that is in this video as well. So let me know if you like this style of content as well. And I hope to see you out there soon. I'm Jimmy James 59, and hey, see you out there in the ladder, folks. Peace.